everyone. My name is Julie, and I organize webinars here at the Claire Ruth Luce Center for Conservative Women. If you're new to our organization, we work with young women in college to help prepare them for leadership in the conservative movement and to promote leading conservative women. We do this through various ways: webinars like this, campus lectures, events across the country, and our intensive internship program in the office. If you'd like to apply for our spring internship or just learn more about us, you can visit our website at cblwomen.org and follow us on social media at the handle CBL Women. Thank you for joining us today as we host Melanie Kirkpatrick. Melanie Kirkpatrick is a writer-journalist based in Connecticut and a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. She is an award-winning journalist and an expert on foreign policy and human rights, focusing on East Asia and the Pacific. She worked for the Wall Street Journal for 30 years, including spending time as deputy editor. Melanie is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a director of the America for Bulgaria Foundation, and a member of the Human Freedom Advisory Council of the George W. Bush Presidential Center. She contributes reviews and commentary to various publications. She is also the author of several books, including Lady Editor, Sarah Josepha Hale, and the Making of the Modern American Woman, which is her newest, coming out this year. She's also written Thanksgiving, the Holiday at the Heart of the American Experience, and Escape from North Korea, the Untold Story of Asia's Underground Railroad. Melanie is the recipient of the 2001 Mary Morgan Hewitt Award for Women in Journalism. She is married to Jack David, a senior fellow and trustee of the Hudson Institute. Today, she'll be speaking on the history and value of Thanksgiving. Please join me in welcoming Melanie Kirkpatrick. Oh, I think you need to unmute.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful.
Julie. Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to be here with you today. And Julie, I thank you for that warm introduction. As Julie mentioned, I've written 2 books on this subject. Thanksgiving, the Holiday at the Heart of the American Experience, which came out a few years ago and is a keepsake volume about the history of the holiday, including readings for Thanksgiving Day and historic recipes. And the second book is Lady Editor, the making of the modern, Sarah Josepha Hale and the Making of the Modern American Woman. And this book grew out of my Thanksgiving book because Sarah Hale is known as the godmother of Thanksgiving. She was the one who inspired Lincoln to proclaim the first in our modern day series of national Thanksgivings. So with all that research behind me in 2 books, it was a little hard to know how to focus on my topic today. But I decided to focus on Thanksgiving and America, and specifically on the 400 years of history we have, which we're going to be celebrating this year. But let me begin with another American holiday, Independence Day. One 4th of July in the 1980s, when I was working for the Asian Wall Street Journal in Hong Kong, I read a tidbit in a local newspaper about the American Day of Thanksgiving. Across the United States today, the columnist declared, families are celebrating the birth of their nation by sitting down to turkey dinners with all the trimmings. We had a good laugh over the writer's confusion about America's national holidays, but it also set me to thinking. In some sense, this was a natural error. A non-American could be forgiven for conflating these 2 homegrown holidays. Both bind Americans to the larger history of our nation. Thanksgiving isn't a patriotic holiday per se, but it's full of patriotic feeling as we join together to give thanks for our shared blessings as a nation. The best expression of this aspect of Thanksgiving Day comes from Benjamin Franklin, who called Thanksgiving Day a day of public felicity, a time to express gratitude to God for the, quote, full enjoyment of liberty, civil and religious. Thanksgiving is America's oldest tradition, dating back to 1621, when pilgrims joined together with Native Americans to celebrate the harvest. The holiday has grown up with the country, and it says a lot about who we are as Americans. It reflects our national identity as a grateful, generous, and inclusive people. No matter when our ancestors arrived in America, when we take our place at the Thanksgiving table, we are part of a continuum that dates back to that harvest feast of 400 years ago. The friendly coexistence between the English settlers and the Native Americans would last only a short period of time before it erupted in war. But that original Thanksgiving pointed the way to the diverse, multicultural people we have become. My research into Thanksgiving covered many aspects of the holiday. I learned about Thanksgivings in Virginia, Texas, Maine, and Florida, which predated the arrival of the Pilgrims. I traced the development of our charitable traditions of caring for the less fortunate on Thanksgiving Day. I looked at how football became a part of Thanksgiving rituals. And of course, don't forget dinner. I studied the history of Thanksgiving dinner and how it came to pass that on the fourth Thursday of November, the vast majority of Americans sit down to the same meal of turkey, cranberries, potatoes, and pie. I'd welcome your questions on these topics and more during the Q&A session. This afternoon, though, I will devote my remarks to the aspect of the holiday that Benjamin Franklin particularly admired. That is, Thanksgiving as a time for expressing gratitude for the full enjoyment of liberty. I'll give illustrations from each of the centuries since the first Thanksgiving. First, the Pilgrims. There are two eyewitness accounts of the first Thanksgiving, yet the word Thanksgiving doesn't appear in either one of them. If you could travel back in time to 1621 and ask a pilgrim to define Thanksgiving Day, his answer might surprise you. For the Pilgrims, a day of Thanksgiving wasn't marked by feasting, family, and fellowship, the hallmarks of the holiday we now celebrate. Rather, for the Pilgrims, days of Thanksgiving were days of religious observance. The original Thanksgivings were called to express gratitude to God for specific blessings, such as a successful harvest, propitious weather, or a military victory against Native Americans. For the Pilgrims and other early European immigrants to our shores, a Thanksgiving Day was profoundly religious, set aside for prayer and worship. From the Pilgrims' perspective, their first Thanksgiving in the New World didn't take place until 2 years after the event that we know as the first Thanksgiving. It was July 1623. And Governor William Bradford declared a day of Thanksgiving in gratitude for a rainfall that ended a drought and saved their harvest. All of the 13 colonies observed religious days of Thanksgiving, and they were the most direct influence on the development of the Thanksgiving holiday. At some point in the 1600s, each New England colony began to designate annual Thanksgiving days, usually in the autumn around the time of the harvest. These celebrations were deemed general Thanksgivings. That is, they weren't called for a specific event, as had previously been the case, but for ordinary, everyday blessings. Connecticut was the first to name a day of general Thanksgiving in 1639 and to make it an annual event. This was an important step toward the holiday we know today. Connecticut's decision to call a day of Thanksgiving for general blessings was controversial. Opponents argued that celebrating an annual Thanksgiving for general blessings, rather than for a specific reason, would make people take God's generosity for granted. However, the idea caught on, and by the end of the 17th century, general Thanksgivings were the norm. Thanksgiving morning was usually spent at church, with the afternoon and evening devoted to feasting with family and friends. General Thanksgivings are what we celebrate today. By the time of the American Revolution, Thanksgiving was a well-established tradition, especially in New England. Then, in the fall of 1789, as the first Congress was about to take a break from its deliberations, President George Washington proclaimed America's first Thanksgiving as a nation. This was the first presidential proclamation of any sort. Believe it or not, the idea of a national Thanksgiving was controversial, and there was a vigorous debate in Congress about whether the president had the constitutional authority to designate a Thanksgiving Day. There were two objections. The first had to do with the separation of powers. Opponents argued that the authority to proclaim a national Thanksgiving rested with the governors, not with the president. The second objection concerned the separation of church and state. Thanksgiving, it was argued, was a religious holiday. It was therefore inappropriate for a president to involve himself. Washington, however, deftly sidestepped these objections. He agreed to issue a Thanksgiving proclamation, but with a twist. He sent his proclamation to every governor, requesting that the governors implement it. He didn't order them to do so. By this maneuver, he was acknowledging that a presidential proclamation doesn't have the force of law. Of course, such was the respect with which Americans held Washington that every state acceded to his request, and Thanksgiving Day was celebrated nationwide. Second, Washington's Thanksgiving proclamation was religiously inclusive. In doing this, he set a valuable precedent, one that subsequent presidents have followed. After Washington and into the first half of the 19th century, presidents mostly declined to call national Thanksgivings. Jefferson famously opposed a national Thanksgiving. In 1777, when he was governor of Virginia, he had issued a Thanksgiving proclamation, but he refused to do so when he became president. Governors, rather, named Thanksgiving days back then, but they did so without coordinating with one another. The confusing result was that the date of Thanksgiving varied from state to state. Many states celebrated in November, but a few marked the holiday in October or even in early December. A traveler with a carefully planned itinerary could manage to have a Thanksgiving dinner every week in the fall. Then, in 1863, Lincoln decided to call a national Thanksgiving. What or who motivated him to do so? The answer is a woman who is known as the godmother of Thanksgiving. Her name is Sarah Josepha Hale, and as I mentioned earlier, she's the subject of my latest book, Lady Editor. I learned about Mrs. Hale during my research for the history of Thanksgiving, and I became fascinated by her and her accomplishments. Hale was the editor of Godey's Ladies Book, the most widely circulated magazine of the pre-Civil War period. It was one of the first national publications, and it was one of the most influential periodicals of its day. This was an extraordinary achievement for a woman in the first half of the 19th century. When Hale's husband died unexpectedly in 1822, leaving her with 4 small children and a 5th on the way, she had to find work. She began to write both poetry and an anti-slavery novel. Their success helped bring her to the attention of a clergyman in Boston who was looking for a woman to edit a ladies' magazine he was starting. Hale got the job and built the new magazine into the first successful magazine for women and one of the first national magazines. By the 1840s, when she launched her campaign for a national Thanksgiving, Mrs. Hale was one of the most famous women in America. For years, Hale used the pages of her magazine to campaign for a national Thanksgiving. As the country moved toward civil war, she believed that a national celebration of Thanksgiving would help preserve the Union. Every American, North and South, would be celebrating on the same day and remembering the blessings of the American Constitution and our way of life. Thanksgiving, she believed, had what she called a, quote, deep moral influence on the character of the nation. As part of her Thanksgiving campaign, she also sent hundreds of personal letters to presidents, governors, congressmen, and other influential Americans, seeking their support for a national Thanksgiving. Presidents Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan all declined to do so, citing the same objections that Jefferson had mentioned. Then, in 1863, after receiving a persuasive letter from Hale, Lincoln decided to call a national Thanksgiving. It was the middle of the Civil War, and Lincoln used the opportunity to appeal to national unity, setting the tone for the day when the country would once again be united. He called on every American, North and South, to celebrate Thanksgiving, quote, with one heart and one voice. What a lovely phrase, with one heart and one voice. Every subsequent American has followed Lincoln's example. His 1863 proclamation is regarded as the beginning of our national Thanksgiving holiday. After Lincoln's death, Hale kept up the pressure on his successors, Presidents Andrew Johnson, Ulysses S. Grant, and Rutherford B. Hayes, all named National Thanksgiving Days. But there remained a snag before Hale's dream of a national Thanksgiving was fully realized. While the overwhelming majority of governors went along with the date that Lincoln and later presidents named for Thanksgiving Day, they were under no obligation to do so. Presidential proclamations don't have the force of law. That required an act of Congress. The country would have to wait until the 20th century for Congress to take action. It was President Franklin Delano Roosevelt who inadvertently goaded Congress finally into action. He had the temerity to change the date of Thanksgiving. In August 1939, FDR announced that he had decided to move Thanksgiving forward by a week. That is, a week earlier than what had then become the traditional last Thursday of the month. The country was in the midst of the Great Depression, and the president's stated reason was economic. There were 5 Thursdays in November that year, which meant that Thanksgiving Day, if celebrated on the last Thursday, would fall on the 30th of the month. That left just 20 shopping days till Christmas. Moving the holiday up a week to November 23rd, Roosevelt believed, would allow shoppers more time to make their purchases, and so the president's dubious theory went, spend more money, thus giving the economy a lift. FDR's idea was doomed from the start. Americans didn't have money to spend on anything, much less on Christmas shopping. So his whole campaign failed. At his press conference, there was something else too. At his press conference, Roosevelt made the mistake of remarking that there was, quote unquote, nothing sacred about the date of Thanksgiving. He might as well have commanded that roast beef henceforth replace turkey as the star of the holiday. The president badly misread public opinion here. His announcement was front page news the next day, and the public outcry was swift and vociferous. College football coaches were particularly upset, since most colleges ended their football seasons on Thanksgiving weekend. It was impossible to change the game schedule at such a late date. Roosevelt's switch turned Thanksgiving Day 1939 into a political hot potato. Now politicians had to read public opinion, examine the local business climate, consider political loyalties, and then decide which day to endorse as the official Thanksgiving Day in their states. Do they stick with tradition and celebrate the holiday on November 30th? Or do they follow FDR's lead and change the date to November 23rd? The 48 states were nearly evenly divided on the question. 23 decided to stick with November 30th, the traditional date, while 22 adopted FDR's date of November 23. The remaining three, Texas, Mississippi, and Colorado, had a happy solution to this problem. They decided to celebrate on both days. It wasn't long before people started referring to November 30th as the Republican Thanksgiving and to November 23rd as the Democratic Thanksgiving, or even Franksgiving after Franklin Roosevelt. A senator from New Hampshire wasn't so polite. He sarcastically suggested that Roosevelt break another tradition. Quote, "Has the president given any thought to abolishing winter?" he asked. Finally, in 1941, Roosevelt admitted defeat. Congress decided to take action, and it passed legislation fixing the date of future Thanksgivings as the fourth Thursday of November. Roosevelt signed it into law. Finally, here in the 21st century, I'd like to recount a personal story that, for me, gives special meaning to Benjamin Franklin's characterization of Thanksgiving as a time to give thanks for the full enjoyment of liberty. Franklin's words were hammered home to me at many points during the course of my research into Thanksgiving, but no more so than by the teenagers I interviewed at a New York City high school for immigrants. Newcomers High School is located in Queens, New York City. And on the day that I visited, about a week before Thanksgiving, the school was home to 850 students from more than 60 countries. They spoke 40 languages. I led discussions in 3 classes about the Thanksgiving holiday, which most of the teenagers were about to celebrate for the first time. These young newcomers had a very personal understanding of the earliest story at the heart of the American experience. For them, the Pilgrim story was their story, and the Pilgrim fathers and mothers were historical reflections of themselves. The Pilgrims themselves had been divided into 2 groups: those who came to the New World seeking religious freedom, and those who came here seeking better lives for themselves and their families. This was also the case for the students I met. A girl from Ivory Coast explained how her father had worked as a houseboy in the old country. Now, she proudly told me, he has a good job with the Metropolitan Transit Authority in New York City. Other kids came to the US in search of the freedom to worship as they pleased. One boy told me he was from Tibet, a country that has not existed formally since China annexed it in 1950. He explained that his Buddhist family couldn't practice the religion of the Dalai Lama in China. But here in America, he proudly told me, they could worship without fear. Then a girl spoke up. She was from Egypt, she said, and she was a Copt, which is an ancient form of Christianity. Her family had come to this country so that they could worship their religion without fear. For the students at Newcomers High, the Pilgrims' story mirrored their own experiences, and they exuberantly claimed Thanksgiving as their own. For them, Thanksgiving was a rite of passage on their journey to American citizenship. I was reminded of the words of the late historian Samuel Eliot Morison, who famously wrote that the Pilgrims are the spiritual ancestors of all Americans, whatever their stock, race, or creed. This brings me to the present day and a closing thought about our coming Thanksgiving. This year, as we mark Thanksgiving Day, Americans are badly divided over politics and culture. Many Americans are asking, can't we do better? As we gather together on Thanksgiving, I pray that it will be a healing moment for our nation, a time to take stock of our many shared blessings, a time to consider what unites us as a nation, not what divides us. Let us remember Benjamin Franklin's description of Thanksgiving as a time to give thanks to God for the full enjoyment of liberty, civil and religious. Like Franklin, Washington, Lincoln, Sarah Josepha, Hale, and many others have enriched our holiday tradition and helped to knit us together as a nation. This history and more is worthy of our remembrance with grateful hearts on Thanksgiving Day, this year and forevermore. Thank you, and let me be the first to wish you a happy Thanksgiving. I welcome your questions on any aspect of Thanksgiving or on what my comments that I just made. Over to you, Julie.
Thank you. That was absolutely lovely. I can definitely say I really enjoyed, and I highly recommend snagging a copy of her book, Thanksgiving. It just teaches you so much, like what she taught is what just spoke about, but also so much more just unique details and bits and pieces of Thanksgiving that I didn't know. And I'm very sad to say that I'm like learning it now, which I'm very thankful I did. Which brings me to a few questions of my own. You guys can shoot some over. I have a few already that had come in before this, so we'll go through some of those. One of my questions would be, what unique or interesting fact about American history stands out to you the most after all the research you've done?
Unique fact about American history in general. Let's see. Gosh, I learned so much. Well, let me say that America is the only country that has a Thanksgiving Day of this sort. There are other places around the world that celebrate what they call a Thanksgiving, and they're usually a religious Thanksgiving. And I can think of only one example of a country that has deliberately, consciously adopted our kind of holiday, and that's Brazil, whose ambassador to the United States went home in the late 40s and introduced an American-style Thanksgiving holiday in Brazil. But what makes the American holiday unique is that it is celebrated by people of all faiths and of none. It's not distinguished by any religion or political belief. It is simply open to all. It's also open to newcomers to this country. And again, I think this is a special feature of the course of American history about how our society is renewed and strengthened and enlivened by the immigrants who join us, unless there are people in the audience of Native American background. Every one of us can trace our history back to another country. Our families didn't originate here. So Thanksgiving is a way to bring us together. And that, I think, is a unique aspect of the holiday and of our culture.
It's very beautiful. One question I would have, things have changed so much in America in the past 5 years. We used to have things that we could kind of tie us together, like holidays, like specifically Thanksgiving, or just different traditions. I mean, sports, these were all things that kind of tied us together as a nation, even though we disagree on different policies. How would you say we could reverse the trend that we've been on for the past several years?
That is such a difficult question, Julie. I pray that we can reverse it. You're right. So much has become politicized. Look at how sports have become politicized in recent years, for example. That didn't used to be the case. Thanksgiving Day has always been a time when family and friends get together and they don't necessarily agree on things. Every family has a grumpy grandpa or a sister-in-law who is not of their political persuasion. But on Thanksgiving Day, we're all one. And we save our fighting for the football game, I think. So how do we get back to where we were? I think part of it will be one way to help us get back is to learn our history. And the young people in our audience today may disagree with me, but my impression is that our history has been distorted in the teaching of many schools. And if we, this of course was, now I'm talking politics, but it was a political issue in the recent gubernatorial election in Virginia. And I think a lot of Americans share that concern that our young people are not learning about how the American government works, how the American economic system works, and what our cultural heritage is. So that would be one way to, I think, help us return to a more civilized, more generous feeling toward people with whom we disagree.
I do think you're right. I think that education will be the thing that saves us if we do it properly. Along that line, do you think that there's something called historical truth now, when even like different historical sites of American history are buying into this historically inaccurate narrative that is being pushed from the left?
Mm-hmm. I do think there is something as truth, and I do think there are standards. One of the things I did when writing Lady Editor, the biography of Sarah Josepha Hale, try to judge her accomplishments by this the context in which she lived. So let me mention a couple of things. She, starting in 1828, she campaigned vigorously for women to have educational opportunities. Education for women was something she wrote about in every issue of her magazine for 50 years. Now, I think that's a tremendous accomplishment, because when she started out in 1828, there was no institute of higher education that admitted women, and half of American women were illiterate. So that contribution to American society is towering from my point of view. And yet today, when she's criticized by some historians as kind of unworthy of respect because she was opposed to women getting the vote. And remember, I think that was the wrong way to judge her. You look at her period of time, and she lived until she was 90, and at the time of her death, in 1879, a majority of American women opposed the vote for women. This is kind of an incredible thing to think about, but women didn't think that women should have the vote. And Sarah Hale's argument, which I think deserves honor, deserves reflection, is that she thought women were of a higher moral character than men, and that you let men get into the rough and tumble of politics, which she saw as a dirty business, but it was women's role to keep reminding them of what the higher moral standard was. I certainly don't want any such system to be adopted today, but I think it's interesting, and I think we should judge her based on that context, rather than look at her from the point of view of 2021.
Excellent. Well, I did not know that tidbit. She sounds like a very fascinating woman from her time. How do you think that she was able to build a career and a reputation that she did? Because it was obviously very countercultural. How did that occur?
She was tremendously motivated by the need to educate her children. Her husband died in 1822, and leaving her with 4 children under the age of 7 and a baby on the way. And she and her husband were very intellectual. Neither had gone to college. As I said, women couldn't go to college, but they would study together every evening after dinner from 8 to 10 at the sitting room table, and they'd study French and the great British writers, and they'd study the sciences, botany, mathematics, and stuff like that, that wasn't usually considered things that women needed to know anything about. So when he died suddenly, she was desperate to find a way to educate her kids. And she, about the only respectable occupation open to women at that time was needlework. And some friends set her up in a millinery shop. Millinery is making hats, and she hated it. So her husband had told her she was a good writer, and she decided she would try to write poetry and sell it. She made, she made some good progress at that. And then she wrote a novel, anti-slavery novel, which was very well received. And as I mentioned in my remarks, it caused her to be invited to be the founding editor of a new magazine for women. She decided to do it, even though it meant that she would have to send her children to live with a range of relatives. She took the baby with her to Boston, but the other children went off to live with various relatives. And she was roundly criticized by people in her hometown of Newport, New Hampshire, for doing something like that. And also they said, you're not going to succeed. No woman has ever succeeded in running a magazine. And indeed, back then, there was no example. She knew of no example of a woman who had made a living as a writer. So then when she started the magazine, she was incredibly prolific. Not only did she run the magazine and write just about half of the entries in the magazine, she wrote books and poetry, and she edited a children's journal for a while, where her most famous poem, Mary Had a Little Lamb, appeared. And so she was really focused on making money to provide for the education of her children. And I'll close by saying that all of her kids were very well educated. The 3 sons, one went to West Point. He was the youngest cadet there, 14 years old. 2 of her sons, the other 2 sons, went to Harvard. One graduated first in his class, and the other wasn't so smart. He graduated only second in his class. And then the 2 girls went to the best seminary for young ladies in Troy, New York, Miss Willard's Academy. So.
Wow. I often will say a good mom can accomplish a lot, and that is an excellent example of that. And I had no idea she wrote Mary Had a Little Lamb. It never occurred to me to think of who wrote that.
No, I always thought Mother Goose wrote it, but
yeah,
does see the hail.
Yeah, wow.
And there was an interesting point there, Julie. The 3rd verse of Mary Had a Little Lamb is long forgotten, but it carries a moral. Most of her poetry for children carries a moral. And the moral of Mary Had a Little Lamb was, be kind to animals.
That's beautiful. Well, she sounds like a lovely person. I do think that I was going to tell everyone at the end, but I do think everyone should grab a copy of this and read it, because I will admit, having got a bachelor's degree in history from a state college in Illinois, I had never heard of her. None of my classes touched on her. She wasn't an important figure that we had talked about, and just in passing even that I remember. And so I think it's interesting to learn about figures like that, women in American history who did so much and accomplished so much and really set the foundation for where we are now. It's fascinating to learn. The next question I have here would be, do you have any new Thanksgiving traditions personally after doing all the research for this book?
I do, and this is what I would urge upon all of you. There is a tradition that was popular briefly, I think, in the 19th century called 5 kernels of corn. And so on Thanksgiving Day now, my family puts 5 kernels of dried corn on our Thanksgiving table. We have a little plate for it, and we put the 5 kernels there. And they represent the Pilgrims and the Native Americans, and for the Pilgrims, there is a legend, not truth, but just a legend, that during their starving time, their governor would allot only 5 kernels of corn to each person to eat. It was, of course, a paltry meal, but they nevertheless gave thanks for it. But the corn also symbolizes the generosity and the help that the Native Americans gave to the Pilgrims. So I think it's a lovely tradition, and it's a quiet memory of that event 400 years ago.
Wow, that is beautiful. That's a nice one. I'm so curious. Thanksgiving is, when people ask me what my favorite food is, I routinely say Thanksgiving dinner. I can't pick one thing. It's the whole unit as a whole is what I really just enjoy most to eat. And it helps that my mom's an excellent cook as well. But that is something that I have not heard of. That's beautiful. Next question here would be, how does the media impact how Americans view our traditions and holidays? And specifically holidays like Thanksgiving, should we watch shows that kind of downplay it or talk poorly or just give inaccurate reflections of it? Should we support that activity, or how should we act as conservatives?
Well, as conservatives, I think we have an obligation to know the history of the holiday, which is often misrepresented, not only in the media, but in history books and school textbooks. One example of that, which is very offensive to Native Americans, is how Native Americans are sometimes portrayed in elementary school classes on Thanksgiving, with the Pilgrims being the hosts, the Indians being the guests, when in fact it was very much a mutual event. The Native Americans brought 3 deer, which would have fed the community for a number of meals. And then also, kids make hats for the Pilgrims with buckles on them, and that's not what they wore. Or they make feather headdresses for Native Americans, and the Indians of New England never wore feathered headdresses. That was something that the Plains Indians did. And then so I think knowing that history is important. The religious roots of the history is something to stress. And I think it's important for everybody, not just conservatives, to stop and think about the blessings we have as American citizens, and also the blessings, of course, that surround us in our families and communities. But it's so easy on Thanksgiving Day to focus on the meal and focus on the football and forget to stop and reflect on why we're here. In my Thanksgiving book, there's a section at the back called Readings for Thanksgiving Day. And that was a last minute addition. I wasn't planning to use it, but I realized I had quotations from that from the research that I had done from various people over 400 years of history. So I included it, and it's become popular. A number of people tell me that they take out the book and read some of those readings around the Thanksgiving Day dinner table. And you don't have to buy my book to do this. You can go online, and I would really urge you to read Lincoln's 1863 Proclamation. It's very beautiful, and especially when you consider that the country was at war when he wrote it.
It is very moving, and just to think of what we've been through as a country, I really loved how you reflected on the various stages of Thanksgiving, and it was always very much pausing and being grateful. It wasn't simply just gathering. It was really being grateful to God for the gifts that we have and just the need for that. And I like that I think it's beautiful that America has made a place for that always. And I really do hope we keep going. This next question is a little different, but I really am curious. Why do you think so many on the left are pro-illegal immigration, but they hate that Europeans immigrated to the continent years ago? If we have so much room now in their minds, why do we look so badly upon our European ancestors for doing the same thing?
Yeah, I can't answer that question. It's cute in my mind. There's definitely a contradiction there.
Yeah, it's definitely something curious. The next question would be just your background it's kind of different. Your background as a journalist, and you worked for the Wall Street Journal for so long, and just that is a very unique career path. As a journalist, do you have any concerns now just for where the field is sort of heading, where it's just kind of diving really into identity politics and creating division?
Yeah, I am deeply worried about not just the future of the country, but the future of the media in our society. In America, the tradition in newspapers has always been to separate opinion from news. And unfortunately, that wall of separation seems to be crumbling. There's a lot more opinionizing going on in what are presented as straight news stories. And that's true on TV and on the internet as well, on online publications. At the same time, there are a growing number of publications, mostly online. The sources of information are widely available to us, and that's a positive thing because we can, and a lot of it is primary sources. If you read about, say, a judicial decision, and you think, oh, that doesn't sound quite right, you can go to the court's website and read the opinion yourself. Now, that's not something a reader wants to do every single day. You want to have a source that you trust to present the material to you and to make a curated selection of what they think you need to know. So, newspaper editors and producers of news and TV used to do that. And I think they've become much more, I know they've become much more politicized. It's hard to find a single source where you can trust what you're reading. That said, there are a number of new publications popping up online, and journalism is in real disarray right now. And I have some hope that we'll be able to figure out how to go forward, because I think there are a lot of readers like myself who want a media organization that tells them the facts with some analysis, but not with a political point of view. So there's a market for such a publication or online publication, and there are ones out there that are trying to address that need. So I think we'll see more successes down the road.
It's very hopeful, and I like that. I love the idea of, yes, there's something better coming, because you're right, we do need that. This next question would be, what's your favorite part of the Thanksgiving meal?
Oh, I'm tempted to throw your comment back at you at all, but I guess cranberry sauce. I really love that. And what else do I love? Well, anything with cranberries in it. And I love the turkey itself. It's really yummy. My husband makes the turkey in my family.
If push came to shove, I might have to say turkey and the gravy combined as my favorite.
Yeah. What's turkey without gravy?
It's delightful, and they must be together in my mind. So this next question is the last one, and we're wrapping up. What books have you been reading lately, or what books would you recommend our young ladies to read? Obviously, I would caveat that with we should definitely both be reading both of these. I think these are really, really important just for us to be aware. You spoke a lot about education, but what else would you recommend when you start reading?
Oh, gee, I have been reading. Most recently, I read a mystery that was I've been so busy giving talks and webinars and and radio appearances that I haven't read as much as I usually do. But there is a new novel that I really loved, and it's called it's by Ha Jin, who's a Chinese writer who moved to America, and it is called, I'm blanking on the name of it, but it's about a Chinese opera singer or a Chinese singer who moves to America. And it is about the difficulty of being an immigrant in America, and very moving in that respect. And it's also about the reach of the Chinese government and how it keeps tabs on people. The surveillance system that it has, and it's really scary, actually, in that sense. So I recommend that to you. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but Ha Jin is the name of the author, and it's his newest book.
Okay, well, I really appreciate that. I love to read, and so I'm always looking for good recommendations for our young ladies, just because I think that the more time spent reading is extremely advantageous, especially now as social media keeps our attention span so short. I think we need really to dig in and learn, and you learn by reading novels like that mystery, like you learn through stories, but you also learn through reading history. And I think that we really appreciate the writing that you've done. So I'd like to thank you so much for joining us for our webinar. Just spending time with us today is really, really much appreciated. And we always love it when people are honoring American history. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I wish all of you a very happy Thanksgiving. And when you sit around the table, please give a thought for Mrs. Hale and the role she played.